Okay, so welcome back to the second of these videos, and this time I want to cover the other half of what is promised in the title of the session, I suppose. So the title of the session, for those who have very short memories, is Activity Theory and Research Intervention, and here I want to move on to the research intervention, but it has to be said that the way I will discuss research intervention is very specific, and it will build very much on what I said before under the heading of activity theory. So I would say, if you think about activity theory in the way that I discussed it in the previous video, you could immediately think of at least 3 different ways in which you might use it for research. And I've coined these 3 headings myself. I haven't taken them particularly from anywhere, but I've called one contextualized experience, one systemic understanding, and one collaborative systemic change. So let's just briefly discuss each of those, but actually it's the third one that I want to spend most of this presentation discussing. So contextualized experience, a lot of educational research, TEL research, is about gaining access to the experiences of practitioners, students, and others who use technology, typically using methods like interviews. And it's interesting because what activity theory offers is a particular way of conceptualizing what experience is. It says, look, experience is a succession of dilemmas, double binds, and other subjective phenomena that arise as a consequence of the contradictions in the activities in which we participate. So one way in which you could use activity theory is to contextualize the experience of the participants that you interview. You could start from their experiences, understand them as a sequence of issues that are posed to them and how they're overcoming them, and then try to understand how those arise within the broader activities. So effectively, as I say in the heading, you provide the context for the experience that people are recounting in things like interviews. Now it's interesting because in the activity theory literature, as in if you look in activity theory journals like Mind, Culture and Activity, which is published by Routledge, which you can usually find online, and there are others too, if you look in the specific activity theory community, you'll find a fair bit of that kind of thing going on. There was a book published originally in Russian in the 1980s and translated into English in the early 1990s called The Psychology of Experiencing by Fyodor Vasilyuk, which actually looked at that in a lot of detail. He wasn't really looking at technology enhanced learning. He was looking at how the experiences of people with very serious psychological disorders, mental health issues, things like that, could be explained by looking at how they arise within the activities in which they participate. So this has a long history. It's done surprisingly seldom in technology enhanced learning journals, surprisingly given how core the notion of experience is to the field. It is done, but it's not done as often as you might expect. It's the middle one that is really dominant, where activity theory is used in TEL research. This notion of systemic understanding, where what we actually do is we map the activity system that we're looking at using a range of different methods, which is perfectly reasonable. So, for example, you might still interview people, but you'd interview a set of different people depending on what the activity system was that you were mapping. So you might interview some students and some teachers and maybe some support staff and whatever. But you might also look at the artifacts, whether that is the artifacts that students make within their learning activity, whether that's policy documents, whether that's traces through the various technological tools, log files, whatever, and you kind of bring it together in a case study in which usually what happens is the activity system is used as the structure to provide the structure for the case study. That is the overwhelming way in which activity theory is actually used in TEL research and in higher education research as well. And I've written a paper about how it's used in higher education research based on an extensive literature review, which you can find on my website if you're so interested. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. It can be done well, it can be done badly. The way in which the core way in which I think it can be done badly is just to label the activity system. It's leading up to what I call the ta-da kind of moment of saying, well, here's the activity system. What's wrong with that is that activity theory is fundamentally interested in development and change, and how activity develops over time. This principle of historicity, development via contradictions, these kind of principles were things that I emphasized in the previous video for a specific reason. So unless you're going to use that activity systems analysis, to examine contradiction and change, then really you're not making the best use of the theory, and what you're really doing is conducting a fairly standard case study in which you've scattered on a little bit of activity theory, like the sugar on top of a cake. It is done very often. It doesn't really invoke the passion that I have for activity theory. That's not really an activity theorist's way of using it, but it is done. But it could be done well. You could map contradictions. You can start to explore the historical development of an activity system presented at a few different stages. You could map the contradictions and start to unpack how those tensions are leading this activity system to progress in one of a number of different directions. There are ways you could conduct a case study around a particular activity system or set of activity systems that would be much stronger. And the core of that will be to be examining contradictions and looking at what they mean, rather than just labeling the elements of the system. So that's the common way of doing it. What I want to just spend, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes or so talking about, though, is the third way, which really arises from how activity theory underlying it all is conceptualized, its underlying philosophical positions, which goes back right to the start of the previous video. Excuse me. If you'll remember back, the idea was to position activity as the substance joining, I suppose, the objective and subjective realms within the same world. Doing that has a number of implications. The best way to develop understanding is to intervene in the real world. Karl Marx famously said, if you want to look it up, it's called the 11th Thesis on Feuerbach, that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. This is a reasonably well-known quote from Karl Marx, who was one of the philosophers I talked about in the previous video. That's not just a personal attack on philosophers as individuals. That's not what he was saying there. What he was doing was making what you might call an epistemological point. If you want to understand how the world works, the best way to do it is to try and change the world, and then examine how the world is when you're trying to change it. Your understanding will be tested there. The world is best exposed to new understanding in the process of change. If you're just trying to access what people say about the world when they're just sitting there being asked questions, you're likely to get a fairly surface level understanding. So there's a bit of an impetus, I suppose, towards trying to change the world and then understanding it. And that can be a methodology for research. So if you think of what a methodology is, we have an overall set of principles, epistemological and ontological principles, that are locked into a research design, and that research design is used in turn to inspire a set of methods via which we get data. And so we might say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to conduct a set of interviews with somebody. That would be the methods, and then I will sit there and analyze the transcribed interviews, something like that. That's a fairly bog standard research methodology, but what would it mean to have a research methodology that really derived from the very beginning from these principles of what activity is, the intersection between the subjective and objective realms, and this impetus for trying to understand activity as a changing and developing phenomenon? What would that mean? And one way in which we can understand what that means is to look at an example, which is a methodology called the change laboratory, where what we do is we try to actually change real activity systems with the people who are involved in those real activity systems using a structured process. So basically, rather than asking participants to come and do an interview, we ask participants to come and do tasks together. And because we're interested in change over time, we generally ask participants to come and undertake tasks together over a sequence of sessions in which we do different tasks that build on each other, and we see what the participants learn about their activity in the process of doing that, and that is ultimately the methodology. So everything I'm going to say in the next period is going to be trying to unpack that a little bit, and that's really the purpose of this second video, I suppose. So the change laboratory is a research intervention. So it's a research project, but it's also a real intervention. There isn't much point in creating fake activities and then trying to change fake activities. If we understand what activity is, we have to be engaging in the real cultural world for this to be very valid. So we try and change a real one, and people work together in a structured and cyclical way to envisage the activity in their organization in which they are to some extent stakeholders. So they are, what you're trying to do is to recruit the community. If you remember Engestrom's triangular model, you're trying to recruit from the community of that activity, what you might call the stakeholders. And people work together within workshops, a sequence of workshops on tasks, and the idea is to nurture expansive learning, which I'm going to talk about now. I did mention before, it's basically the process by which the object of activity is expanded and changed. And you, as the researcher, are going to be in the workshops with the people, learning with the participants. So there are a number of outcomes that typically happen from this. Actually, the new activity system gets designed. Real change often happens. The participants design new artifacts to support that, artifacts from which we can learn rather a lot about what they're trying to do. They might develop new concepts, even write up new proposals, and the participants themselves get changed in expansive learning. Expansive learning changes both structures and people together. So as a research methodology, it does say quite a lot about how to design the project. Not all research methodologies are equally prescriptive about all aspects of the projects that fall under their remit. So for example, let's take phenomenography as a research approach. It says quite a lot about how to analyze the data, and a little bit about how to design the interviews, which should be very unstructured. Other approaches, so for example, case study, doesn't say so much about analysis. Basically, the point is that methodologies are differentially prescriptive. I would say that in some ways, the change laboratory is quite prescriptive. It says a lot about how to design the project, and we're going to talk about that on the subsequent slides. It doesn't say a lot about how you have to analyze. You will generate a lot of data in a change laboratory project, and it doesn't say a lot about how you have to analyze those. You could use thematic analysis and try and collaboratively analyze things with the participants, although sometimes people generate the data and then try to analyze it for their own purposes at the end. I've seen people using a whole host of different forms of analysis on the data, but it does talk a lot about how to generate the data, and that's what we're really going to talk about. Now, for me, and there are a number of places where you can find the change laboratory described, and I'll provide a couple of references at the end, but for me, and when I write about this, there are two sources: expansive learning of Engström and double stimulation from Vygotsky, that are overlaid on each other, almost like a lattice. And when taken together, to me, they form the source of the power of this approach. So for me, the core things you need to understand if you're going to look at a change laboratory research project are expansive learning and double stimulation. So I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. So double stimulation is a very old concept. So I mentioned in the previous video that the era in which Vygotsky was active was the 1920s to the early 1930s. He died young of tuberculosis, and yet in his very short career he was almost alarmingly productive. It's a bit depressing really when you realize he died sort of younger than I am now, and he'd already done all this stuff. And what he was interested in was, how is it that people come to decide to take action? One of the things he was interested in was volition. And people approach situations which are very, very difficult, in which they actually find it very difficult to take a decision to come to a course of action, and they use artifacts to help them. And for him, for Vygotsky, that was one of the differences between humans and other forms of life, is they use cultural artifacts to help them in their volition, and this is the cornerstone of what he called higher mental functions, i.e. the ones that are not biologically determined. So what he did was to examine that in experiments. So he would deliberately give somebody a task in an experiment that was hard. Actually so hard that just doing it wouldn't be possible. They wouldn't know what to do. It would be beyond their current ability level, shall we say. And then, having given them that task, which was the first stimulus, he would provide a second stimulus, which would be some help in order to do the task. Often this is an artifact that is brought in that they can use to address the task. Sometimes it's the help of some sort of experimental assistant. But the core thing is that help enables them to do the task, and what he's interested in is what can the learner do with cultural assistance that they can't do without cultural assistance. And this led to his very famous concept of the zone of proximal development, which is the difference between what the learner can do with help and what they can do without it. So the zone of proximal development is, if you look at the diagram on the slide, is the middle, how can I put that, is the concentric circle in between what the learner cannot do at all and what the learner can do unaided. It's the one that sits at the border between those two. Now, for teachers, the ZPD, as it's called, the ZOPED, as it's sometimes called in the US, has become a very influential concept. we here are more interested in what people can collectively do rather than just individuals, but this logic can be maintained. So what we do is we give people tasks that are very, very difficult to do, and then we provide them with some help. And what kind of help we might provide them with is something we're going to talk about. So let's think about this just for starters in terms of the difference between objects and artifacts. So when the first stimulus is introduced, the experimental subject in Vygotsky's experiments and the participants in the change laboratory, they will focus on the task, which is the first stimulus is the task. When the second stimulus is introduced, they're not supposed to focus on that itself. The second stimulus is not a thing they should be focusing on. It's something they should be using to address the task. So the second stimulus is used to address the first stimulus. So once again, we have a tripartite mediational triangle being set up of people, first stimulus and second stimulus. Okay, so it's a form of deliberate mediation. And together, the second stimulus and the experimenter, which in a change laboratory project would be the researcher, i.e. potentially you, they are cultural assistants. They represent the culture. So the point is that by using the tool, and partly, as we've said, internalizing it over time, they will increase their volition. They will increase, perhaps to use a slightly more modern sounding term, they will increase their agency. There's no guarantee they will, and Vygotsky was interested in when they do and when they don't. However, that's not our interest. We actually want them to do that. We want them to change their activity systems, and so we'll give them help that we think is going to be genuinely helpful. So the purpose here is to understand that if changing the world was easy, people would just do it unaided. But changing the world in fundamental ways is very hard. It actually can be a good thing to do, but it certainly is a good thing from our point of view of trying to understand it. So we want to help people change the world, which is a difficult thing. So we're going to take a double stimulation approach to that. Okay, so that's all I want you to take from this slide is there are tasks that it is hard to do, nonetheless that might be worthwhile to do, and we could give people help to do them. And if we do that, it's going to look like a certain kind of thing. We provide a certain structure. Okay, that's the first part of the change laboratory way of thinking. The second part derives from work that Engström and his colleagues have been doing since the 1980s. So it's a slightly newer set of concepts called expansive learning. Excuse me. So Engström was interested in studying situations of radical change. Radical change can mean a lot of things, of course. You'll know, because I talked about it on earlier slides, that it's situations where the object of activity is changed, and that is hard. A typical thing you might find, for example, in a TEL study is, and in fact I published a paper in which I largely found this in 2013, if you look on my thing, is we introduce some technology into a system, and somehow some of the rules might get changed, and there's contradictions with that, and the division of labour might get affected, and there's all sorts of contradictions that do happen. You'll find in real situations the object is remarkably persistent, probably because they're the result of such a lot of struggle to get there in the first place. So objects are one of the most, it's almost easier to change all the other parts of the activity system than the object. The object is the stick in the mud that changes very, very slowly, if at all. Yet they do change, but when they change, they are moments of dramatic rupture, usually, not moments of iterative, modest changes. So Engestrom's been very interested to look at situations where it does happen, which are not humdrum every day, but rare. And the end point that he reached is that when expansive learning happens, it has a certain pattern to it. This arises, I'm not going to go into all the detail of this because it would take way too long, but it arises from he's been studying this for decades. There are theoretical reasons. He dove back into Marxist theory and looked at a concept of Marx as called ascending from the abstract to the concrete. You're free to go and read about that if you have time. He also looked at this empirically, and he came up with this kind of model, and it's the model that he came up with I want to focus on rather than how he derived it. So basically, expansive learning has a cyclical appearance where cycles happen, we go round and round, and sometimes there are cycles nested inside other cycles, and sometimes elements go out of order and we sort of short circuit the cycle, but that unless in some way this cycle happens, expansive learning will fail. And some parts of this are remarkably counterintuitive. Some parts I'd say people find very obvious, but some parts are not very obvious. And there are other ways of looking at how radical change happens, and Engestrom's compared the expansive learning cycle to other ones, such as the theory of how tacit knowledge becomes explicit knowledge in organizations, which is Nonaka and Takeuchi, and all these other kinds of theories of how organizations undertake radical change. And there are some commonalities and some differences. So let's focus on this. The first thing is that people reject established wisdom, current practices, and existing plans. This is questioning. This is ironically one of the things that many other theories overlook. So people are confronting problems and they reject how those problems have been formulated. That is fundamental, and unless people are really doing that, they won't really be in a position to change the world. And it's interesting how many approaches to changing the world sort of rely on kind of just giving people a task or a problem, giving people a task hoping they'll do it, giving people a problem hoping they'll solve it. And actually that misses the point that's being raised here, that people have to feel and recognize that there's a real problem, and feel and recognize that there's something about how this is currently being addressed that is just totally inadequate. And actually, therefore, one of the early things we might do if we were trying to create expansive learning is to help people to look at what the established wisdom is and what the shortcomings in that are. The next one is equally counterintuitive, which is people start to analyze both the present way of doing things and how things were done in the past. This is counterintuitive, not because people think it's completely unnecessary, although some people think the historical part is completely unnecessary, but because they don't understand why we emphasize this so much at the beginning. People often want to develop solutions. They want to jump to thinking about what we could do in the future. They're impatient to get to that stage. And ultimately, studies of expansive learning have shown that that is the surest way to quick failure. What you actually need to do is to understand the present situation. If in the process of questioning you come up with a set of things that people are frustrated about, dilemmas, shall we say, in their existing practices, dilemmas and double binds and other things like that, critical conflicts that they're experiencing, one of the things we need to do is to contextualize those. So I'm using phrases that are supposed to remind you of things I said earlier, because that is what is going on here. And we need to understand how those fit into a wider system. We need to understand how the dilemmas that different members of the community experience fit into a wider system, fit together. And we need to understand how that's arisen. Why is this system the way it is? And that is for historical reasons. And so focusing on the present and the past is surprisingly important. And it can also, at a subjective level, focusing on that can be a good way of developing a common understanding in the group of people who are trying to change the world. You can also see what changes people have tried to make before here and that didn't work, and why, what changes did make sense back then, and why did this happen in this way. Maybe this did make sense before, appreciate that, but equally appreciate why it no longer makes sense. Coming up with these kind of things is a very, very good foundation for subsequent change. Now, having done that, we finally get to the thing that people want to start from. So one bit that is obvious is we start developing models for new solutions, roughly what they might look like. And the process of modeling involves creating simplified models, comparing them against each other, thinking of different models, maybe going off and looking at models that other people have used elsewhere, trying to steal, borrow, etc., things from elsewhere, or just developing your own ideas, and comparing them, contrasting them, thinking through their implications, and thinking about those in terms of what your current problems actually are and how they relate to the current way of doing things and how changes historically happened around here, as it were. So this is modeling. And at some point we will come up with a short list. You normally start with lots of models, come up with a short list of models. In some cases it's ideal perhaps to go down to one temporarily, but not always is that possible. And you start to examine the model. So this is the fourth phase. So people start working with the model. They start to go and talk to other people who are also intersecting with, or participating, shall we say, in the activities, seeing how this might work. They might try and test it out a little bit in their day-to-day practices, conduct what we might call little experiments, experiments as understood in the day-to-day way of speaking, not randomized controlled trials, but just little micro interventions. They examine it, and then at some point they try to implement it. There's a collective kind of effort to try to see if this can work. And at all these stages, different contradictions will be exacerbated. And sometimes those contradictions will be so severe and the model will fail so dramatically that actually we short circuit the cycle and immediately go back to modeling, or immediately realize we didn't understand something about the existing system, so we go back to the analysis phase or whatever. So these cycles are not that, it's a cycle, it's not a linear progression. So sometimes we short circuit back, or sometimes launch a new expansive learning cycle within the old one. Engestrom's work studies this kind of thing in some detail in some papers. And at some point we come up with something that is at least feasible, and we start to reflect on the process. We critique what we have been doing as a group, as it were. We identify further requirements, and we start to think about whether we can get away without going around this cycle again. And sometimes we might try and consolidate the new practice. And if we get there, then we're into the realm of perhaps having actually successfully undertaken some expansive learning. So this is the kind of set of actions. So if we remember the distinction between activities and actions, let's imagine expansive learning as an activity in which questioning, analysis, modeling, examination, etc. are the actions within the activity, the actions generated by the activity, and each of those actions is hard. Now, what I want to say is Engestrom's work has emphasized a lot that there are different kinds of these actions. So there are different ways of modeling, different ways of examining, different ways of implementing, different ways of questioning, etc. His work does talk about that in some papers in quite a lot of detail. But that's not a prerequisite. So long as there's some sort of modeling, some sort of examining, etc., then you can still get to expansive learning. The one place in which we have to be pretty strict is at the analysis phase. We really do need what he calls actual empirical analysis, which is understanding the system as it is now, and historical analysis, understanding the system as it has arisen. We can't get away without having both of those. So that's one where there are two types and we need both of them. Now, what I want you to notice is that each of those actions has the potential to be difficult, has the potential to be something that people confronted with might find beyond their ability. I'm in none too subtle a way trying to link this back to double stimulation, of course. So what's going to happen here is we're going to overlay expansive learning onto double stimulation. That's what's going to happen. Now, before we get to that stage, let's just consider a few practical things. What is a methodology? What is a methodology? Okay, a methodology is something that takes some principles that we believe about the world, epistemological and ontological principles, the kind of thing that I'm sure will be discussed elsewhere in the program, but basically ontological principles are assumptions that we make about the world, epistemological principles are assumptions that we make about knowledge. Of course, activity being the link between the objective and subjective realms of the same world makes quite a lot of these assumptions from the very beginning. A methodology is about taking these kind of assumptions and applying it to make up a research design. That's really what a methodology is. And at some point we have to then talk, having been talking about the principles for a while, we have to talk about what the design bit's going to look like. So often we have to talk about, shall we say, sampling. If you were dealing with a survey kind of methodology, you'd be thinking in terms of populations and samples. If you were talking about a case study kind of design, you'd be thinking in terms of selecting the case and bounding the case. Different approaches have different ways of thinking about this. For the change laboratory approach, the fundamental thing is to start off by thinking of what we call an intervention unit, which is usually going to be an activity system that we choose because we think that it could potentially change and therefore we could learn something. So it has to be the kind of activity system we want to talk about. If you want to learn about something, I don't know, one I did before was learning in postgraduate built environment education, then I chose an activity system in postgraduate built environment education, right? So it has to be valid, but it also has to be something where you think there's the recognition of a need for change. If you're really wanting to make the change in the organization rather than just learn about it, you might choose something organizationally strategic, if you can. There is, I would say, at PhD level, a bit of opportunism goes on here, and we know that. But there are certain ideals, and we should aspire to them as closely as we can. We want to select participants. We need to keep this manageable. So I wouldn't want to do a change laboratory with much less than 10 people. I certainly probably wouldn't want to go more than 20 though, otherwise it's going to be difficult to manage their engagement with the tasks. And you've got a bit of a contradiction here from the beginning, because everybody's supposed to have experience of the same object of daily work. So you want people who are really engaged with the same activity, not kind of on paper are the same kind of people, really engaged with the same activity, the real actual same activity. And that's likely to bring in immediately a load of tensions because, as we've said, activities have a division of labour, people with different kinds of expertise and authority. So there might be people who are line managers of other people, teachers and students working together, whatever. There'll be a lot of power relations going on there. But we want to bring in as many different people as we can. But we need to maintain a principle that people have to be able to speak openly and directly. So there's can be a bit of a trade-off there. If there are some people who won't speak, if other more powerful people are there, you have a bit of a thing. You have a bit of a dilemma. You're confronting a dilemma, and you have to figure out how to address that. You might decide to exclude some people. You might decide to include everybody and just try to manage it in the sessions. You might try at a certain point have separate sessions and then bring them together at other points, whatever. But these are the dilemmas. We need different people. There will be power conflicts and imbalances there, but we need everybody to speak openly and directly. That is a design decision. It's a contingent decision. It's a craft skill to figure out how to deal with it. And we're going to schedule a load of workshops in which people will confront tasks. So, well, we need enough sessions to actually support an expansive learning cycle. As you might have deduced immediately from the preceding slides, that means more than one workshop, most likely. So you're asking something from these participants. This is a bit of a commitment. I have many PhD students now who are doing change laboratory projects in the department. Some of them I supervise, some of them I don't, but are decided to do it anyway. And I say to them, look, if you're interested in doing a PhD that's the least possible work, the change laboratory is simply not the approach you're going to choose. So the change laboratory is labor intensive, and there's no getting away from that. But if you believe in it, you can achieve something quite good with it if you're prepared to put the effort in. But you're asking something from you. You know, it's quite a bit of work for you, and it's quite a bit of work for the participants. And you need to just be really, really clear about that from the very beginning. And you need to have the sessions often enough to maintain momentum, and that tasks can build on earlier tasks. So what happens, so for example, sometimes they're scheduled each fortnight, so each 2 weeks, something like that. But equally, you're going to need to be a bit reactive. Depending what happens in some session, you might change a subsequent session. You need time to be able to do that. So it can't be probably daily, right? You need to be reflecting yourself. So there is again another design dilemma. You probably also need to take into account the fact of how often participants actually can agree to do something. And you need to think about how this activity, the change laboratory, is going to be positioned in relation to other activities in the organization, including the activity that you're trying to change, but it's surrounding neighbors. So you need to think about, there isn't just one solution to the problems, but you need to think about how is this going to be positioned in relation to management, staff representatives, so managers, trade unions. How might staff be allowed to devote a bit of time to this? If you can convince the organisation that this actual change is worthwhile and that people should be given the time to look at this, you've actually got a stronger project. If you can't, you might still be able to do the project, but it's an avenue of possibility you should be considering. And how will people who are members of the project communicate their ideas outside the group? At certain points they might need to do that. And then, as we'll discuss in a minute, there are certain aspects to the task design, and you'll need to have materials prepared. And one of the things we talk about in the approach is called mirror data, which is illustrations of practice problems. Can be excerpts from policy documents, can be all sorts of examples, but what's often done actually is we start going out photographing things, doing a bit of ethnography on our own before the intervention starts. Sometimes we interview people on video and we use those videos in the session. Again, I mean, all of this is going to need to be ethically cleared. So documents, videos and transcripts, and again we need to think about that from the beginning, who can generate them. Sometimes part way through the project you'll find that participants start going off generating this stuff. There's probably going to be a time at the very beginning of the project where much of the responsibility will fall to you. Remember, the agency of the participants is something we want to create and nurture and generate and support and develop all these kind of words. But at the very beginning, some of this labour is going to fall on you. So what does it look like? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to have double stimulation tasks that guide people through the expansive learning cycle. This is, it probably is not that much of a surprise. In the modern way of doing double stimulation tasks, people have built on Vygotsky's earlier ideas, and so we have these elements. We have the mirror data so that people can get access to real aspects of the dilemmas in the practice inside the room. So we bring examples of practice problems into the room. As I say, sometimes for subsequent sessions, in between sessions, participants can go and get that. And they can agree to, I'll bring this next time, right? That would be useful. That happens. But sometimes as a researcher, you'll have to provide some. We have a first stimulus, which is a task, remember from the previous slide. And the task is going to be related to an expansive learning action, questioning, analysis, modeling, implementation, whatever, process reflection. You'll remember the cycle from the earlier slide. We have a second stimulus, which is something that can help the people to try and address the first stimulus task. And then we anticipate some of the practicalities around this. So, social organisation. Are we expecting that there'll be subgroups addressing the task and then coming together in a plenary? Are we perhaps even hosting different sessions if we think power play can be a problem in certain moments? We're thinking about this, so there's a bit of social organisation and planning it out as a set of transitions. We want to do some documenting. This is for the purposes of the participants in the session. So sometimes what happens is we come to a later task and we say, well, this is the thing now, we need to think about how we can do this. And actually the second stimulus we give them to help is something that the participants themselves developed in an earlier session. So sometimes participants develop a load of ideas, you then present them with a new challenge and you say, that looks quite hard, but think through all these things you did before. Can we use these ideas now? So there's a bit of an iterative thing here where second stimuli later on can be you bringing back things the participants earlier developed. But in order for you to do that, we have to make sure that things in the sessions are being documented. There are flip charts, there are diagrams, sometimes people use workbooks, all kinds of things like that. We need things to, in some sense, be persistent so that you can build on things. Okay, and the final thing is we need some sense in which sessions are recorded. This will partly be, of course, useful as your research data, but also when you're analysing things in a change laboratory, there's often two kinds of analysis going on. There's one kind of analysis is in what we might call interim analysis, you're doing quite quickly, where what's happening is you're thinking about what happened in this session so that you can think whether the plan you had for the next session is still going to work and whether there's anything from this session you need to carry forward. So for example, that from the documentation. There's another kind of analysis which is how I'm analysing data to present in my PhD thesis or my journal article or whatever. Sometimes those can be very closely related and other times not. But there's a lot of recording needs to go on so that you as a researcher can conduct these various forms of analyses. Okay, so what we do is, as I've hinted verbally several times now, is the change laboratory, the way I look at it anyway, is taking these two things, expansive learning, which has these actions, and double stimulation, which has these task design elements, and overlaying them on top of each other. Now this is an oversimplified way of how it might look, but it makes the point, I think. If you think of making an initial design for a change laboratory, it might look something like that, where you tabulate. And what this has the advantage of doing is it allows you to start to think strategically from the beginning about the things you might want to have in place, and how the progression through the change laboratory project, the sequence of workshops, might happen. It has a couple of disadvantages to think like this. The first is it might lock you into inflexible thinking. I don't think that disqualifies this as an approach in the sense of having a plan and then being prepared to amend your plan in light of events is, to me, still preferable to having no plan. So I think it's good to map things out, but we should be a bit realistic that actually when we map out the first few sessions, we might be rather more certain about what's going to happen, and in the later things we might be less certain. We should expect as participants develop their own voices in this process. That's something we actually want to support and nurture, that what happens will vary more and more and more from what we originally intended. We might have to take into account the fact that it might not go in this order: questioning, analysis, modelling, examination. We might suddenly have a short circuit where something goes wrong. People feel they need to go back to something else. This happens all the time. So it's a remarkably prescriptive approach in terms of the amount of detail it allows you to think about from the beginning, but we still have to be prepared to be flexible and tactical. But it does give you a strategy. So this is one way to start to think about how to design a change-based research project. So what are examples? Well, one of these in which I was involved was to design and implement an integrated 5-year pharmacy curriculum. So this wasn't in the UK, this was in another country, where the government suddenly said every pharmacy department in the country has to have an integrated 5-year pharmacy curriculum. The notion that you have different modules taught by different disciplines, like this module's taught by somebody from chemistry and this module's taught by somebody from somewhere else, which is the normal way we do things as of now, is illegal by September. And I think they announced that at the start of January or something like that. So people had 9 months to get this thing in place. And so we designed, and I was involved in a project that designed an entire 5-year pharmacy curriculum, bringing together academics from the I think it was 5 different departments that were involved in teaching this. Clearly pharmacy is the core department, had the most participants, but there were people from other departments like chemistry, who I always remember because their ideas were totally different from everybody else's. And we designed this thing, and there were student representatives and so on. So we learned a lot about pharmacy education by literally having to design a new curriculum and understand how it's being done at the moment and how that needs to change. Another one, which was a PhD student of mine who's now finished, was about designing a new framework for technology enhanced learning in a military training establishment, a military education establishment, that was all about allowing these people who were training to be military engineers to collaborate with external experts. And here what we were doing was dealing with strongly enforced historical rules. Think about military settings. You can't get much more hierarchical than that. People have literally have military ranks. And they were focused on developing how can these learners come together and develop their agency to collaboratively solve things rather than going by the book, to be able to engage with external engineering experts who are not part of the military hierarchy, and to do so using things like their own mobile devices that historically have been regarded as rather challenging for the military systems because they're not locked down. Typically in this was the British military, they're not locked down terminals with very careful ways of managing the security. So this was developing a new way of managing technology enhanced learning, in which the participants were some learners who were doing a master's level. They were master's level mechanical engineers from a military background. They were their trainers, they were people who taught that course, and they were military managers who managed the relationship between this military training establishment and the military from which these learners had been seconded. So there were three kinds of participants in that project, and they developed a new way of managing technology enhanced learning, new devices, new rules, new everything. Another one of my PhD students did a project in which they were managing education in the humanities. So they were looking at a doctoral training consortium kind of establishment, in which what happens is, well, okay, so this consortium was all about fostering doctoral training in the humanities, which has a very lone scholar model in the humanities, and the humanities is subject to a lot of political pressure. There are questions about the extent to which the humanities are relevant to the modern world and need to be funded at all, and all this kind of thing. So these two problems were seen as in some ways related. So there was this notion that actually if we got these humanities scholars together to collaborate with each other, they could create genuine solutions. They were very bright people. Genuine solutions to real problems, and many of these people were interested in the history of literacy and things like that, and they worked with a charity, a national charity, to examine new ways in which children could be encouraged to develop their interest in literacy skills, and in doing so they also enriched their own research education. So this was about creating an activity system that would be a new relationship between a doctoral training consortium in a university and a national charity, and so on and so on. So another student of mine was looking at how academics and instructional designers in a particular setting, which was in a Middle Eastern country where the very profession of instructional designer is very new, might be developed. How can we develop an activity system that over time and persistently fosters collaboration between these two kinds of stakeholders? And another student of mine is looking at how to create an entire sustainable campus. So to embed education for sustainable development across an entire campus in terms of campus activities, in terms of every single teaching, every single course that's offered on that campus. How can ESD's principles be embedded in it, and so on. Now you'll notice one of those students, specifically the humanities one, that project didn't have a lot to do with technology on the surface, and the others did. What you'll notice is there isn't really an opportunity here for a project that is just about saying, let's look at technology in isolation. This project is all about technology. It's technology, 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 technology to its very root. That will never happen because, I suppose, the fundamental assumption of activity theory is that technology is embedded in real human practices. So by changing human practices, we realize that new technologies are required. We either need to stop using some technology and start using another one, use this technology in different ways, develop new technologies, develop new tools, whatever. But that is an integrated process. It's viewing technology as integrated into human practices. So all of these technology enhanced learning projects, they end up being not only about technology, and that's a crucial thing to realize from the beginning. It's also interesting that even students whose projects were ostensibly not about technology at all, which is in the examples on that slide, it's basically the third one, the charity one, the humanities one. That student was not interested in technology enhanced learning. They weren't signed up for that kind of program. Actually, it did end up being about technology to some extent. So activity theory does position all human activity, human practice as artifact mediated. So we do need to appreciate that, but this is the kind of thing that I've been involved in, that my PhD students have been doing, people in the department are doing, and you can, I would say, let me show you on the slide, you can make real change here. You can learn a lot, I take that as a given, but you can make real change. And these are things that two students have said to me, shockingly real results, and this is not a toy. So for example, I mean, I'd say one almost unexpected problem of luxury is the sustainability campus project. That student has been so successful with creating that sustainability campus through his project, and has made such a lot of change, and is now being invited onto so many follow-up activities, and it's taken on such a life of its own. He's actually struggling to find time to write his thesis. So this is not just a toy. You know, this is a thing that can generate real change, and you can really learn a lot. But that's kind of the point, that if we want to learn about the world, we will focus on change and development, and therefore expose the world to better understanding, I suppose. It's only when the world is slightly broken and changing that we can see the structures that underlie it in sharper relief, I suppose is the logic. So we can focus on can questions. How can this happen? Yeah, asking about potential. Think about the zone of proximal development. What is the zone of proximal development for this kind of activity? How can it change? We can examine that, as opposed to many other research approaches that are just about how does this, or you know, how do these kind of people experience this kind of phenomenon in this setting. It's a slightly different kind of research question that focuses on change and development and allows us to learn with participants. This is a very advanced research methodology. It's a lot of work, it's very theoretical, it's not for everybody. I understand that, everybody understands that, but it is for some people, and quite a few people in the department, having had me nag them about why it's a good idea, have gone on to do things they're really very, very happy with indeed. So I therefore think it's worth talking to you about it. So yet again, we are confronted with the fact that we're now sitting there at home with you watching, hopefully if you got this far, my video, as opposed to sitting in a room at the residential doing this kind of thing together in a workshop. So we shall live with it, but I'll just show you the kind of thing I did have in mind, would be to get you in groups to imagine a design. What would you focus on? What kind of intervention unit would you choose? What kind of participants would you recruit? How might you structure the process? What kind of thing do you think you might learn from that? I think, especially when I think of the range of projects that have been undertaken in the department, I think it's fair to say there are a lot of different answers to that question. For now, especially if you think this is the kind of thing you might be interested in, work through the task on your own. I think it will be a very worthwhile thing, can be a very, very interesting research project. Now, in some ways I wish I'd put this at the end of the first video, but anyway, I didn't, so let's just move on. I've said at one point that activity theory can be difficult to get to grips with. I don't think you get a smooth curve of learning either. I think it's a bit jagged, where you suddenly have a breakthrough in your understanding, and that leads you to the next plateau, and then you have the next breakthrough, and so on. So I would say there are a lot of books out there that claim to teach you about activity theory, and they are in two different camps really. There are a number of books which are for beginners and they tend not to be that brilliant. And there are some other books which cover the work in a lot of detail, but beginners find very, very difficult to read. So this book by Andy Blunden, An Interdisciplinary Theory of Activity, is extremely thorough and covers the philosophical underpinnings, for example, in a lot of detail. And that book has influenced my thinking a lot, but people find it very difficult to read. There's another book called Acting with Technology by Victor Kaptolinin and Bonnie Nardi, which is similarly thorough, but it's not from an educational perspective, it's from a human-computer interaction perspective. One of the things you'll realize about activity theory if you get into using it is how many disciplines it's used in and how many countries it's used in. But nonetheless, people using it from different disciplines have different priorities, I suppose. So that's a good book. That also influenced me, but it doesn't have anything about education or learning in it. It's all about just technology use. So I find myself unable to totally enthusiastically recommend any next book as introductory reading, but there are a couple of books that are at least okay. So one is called Activity Systems Analysis Methods by Lisa Yamagata-Lynch. I think it under-problematizes the concept of contradiction a bit. That would be my main problem with that book, is it does seem to set up contradictions as just kind of tensions. I wish it had gone into a bit more detail on that, but the strength of the book is it's gentle and it has plenty of practical examples, which I haven't been able to cover in this couple of hours of talking. And another book which some people have found useful is Activity Theory Perspectives on Technology in Higher Education. So that's by Elizabeth Murphy, and I can't remember the name of the second author. It's pixelated on my screen, so I think the surname is Rodriguez Manzanares, but I can't remember the first name. I apologize. That's similar actually, in that it gives you a kind of gentle overview. I wish it had gone into more detail on certain aspects of the theory, and it's a bit, it implies very much, both of these books imply very much there's kind of only one way to use the theory, that is their way. I don't really believe that, but nonetheless, so long as you approach these books with a degree of healthy skepticism, then they are useful. They're useful artifacts, shall we put it that way. And both of those books are expensive hardbacks that cost more than £100 British each. However, if you go on Lancaster One Search, you can get access to them for free online, and you can download bits and chunks of them as PDFs and so on. So, and secretly, it's not that hard to find online PDFs anyway if you just go around on Google, but we shall see how official the versions you find are. But nonetheless, you can get access to the whole books via Lancaster University Library. If you want to hear or read a chapter-length introduction to the Change Laboratory as opposed to a book-length one, then that book, Theory and Method in Higher Education Research, Volume 1, contains a chapter by me in which I go into some of the detail. I mean, to some extent, what I've been talking about in this video is kind of based on that book chapter. There are longer introductions. There's a book by Verkunen and Newnham called The Change Laboratory, which explains it at book length, and if you do get into this, it's worth reading. Although again, I find that book a bit limited in some regards, and one day I have threatened to write a book that presents my view on some of these things, but that's not yet written. So this is just a selection of next reading. The first two books in particular are about activity theory in general and are beginner's introductions, and the latter one is what I tried to make a beginner's introduction to the Change Laboratory approach. So if you made it this far, congratulations, you've listened to me go on and on and on for 2 hours now with a sore throat from what I hope is not coronavirus, but who knows. So I apologise for all the coughing and spluttering and needing to drink tea and so on. But I hope this was somewhat useful to you, and if you do go down this route, I very much hope some of you will, and you take this, you know, to be like a PhD project. I'd be very, very interested in that. Please do feel free to ask me questions. I'm easily contactable by email, and thank you very much for listening.